Picture a ship that stretches longer than 2 football fields laid end to end, and somewhere inside its hull are 9,200 parking spaces, stacked 16 decks high, all sailing across open ocean at once. That's not a warehouse. That's not a stadium. That's a single vessel, moving under its own power, and it just took the title of the largest car carrier ever built. The company that built it doesn't make ships for a living. It makes electric cars. This is the BYD Shenzhen, and there's a mechanical detail buried in its hull that almost nobody outside heavy shipping has heard of. Something to do with how it recaptures its own fuel instead of burning it off. And there's a real problem hiding underneath this achievement too. One that has nothing to do with steel and everything to do with money. And it involves what happens when this ship sails home empty. These videos take real research to put together, so if you're finding this useful, hit subscribe and the bell so you don't miss the next one. Where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. Let's orient ourselves here before we get into this, because the backstory matters more than the steel. For most of the last century, the companies that built cars and the companies that moved cars across oceans were never the same company. Automakers built vehicles. Ship owners, mostly Japanese and Norwegian firms with names like Wallenius Wilhelmsen and Höegh Autoliners, owned the specialized car carriers, and they rented that capacity out by the day. It was a clean division of labor. Detroit, Tokyo, and later Shanghai built the product. Oslo and Tokyo owned the boats that carried it. Nobody who made cars for a living needed to know the first thing about ballast tanks or bunker fuel, because the ship owners handled that, and everyone accepted the arrangement because it had worked since the post-war boom. That's the quiet rule this whole story breaks. Whoever controls movement sets the price of everything that moves, and for decades, car makers simply paid whatever that price was. Then the math stopped working. In 2019, chartering a large car carrier ran about $17,000 a day, a rounding error against the value of the cars on board. By the end of 2023, that same daily rate had climbed to $115,000, close to 7 times the pre-pandemic average, according to shipping analyst Clarkson's research. The cause wasn't a shortage of demand. It was the opposite. China's vehicle exports jumped 57% in a single year, hitting 5.22 million units in 2023, with electric and hybrid models leading the surge. Every one of those cars needed a hull to sit on, and there simply weren't enough hulls. Chinese automakers found themselves competing against Japanese and European brands for the exact same limited pool of ships, bidding rates higher with every fixture. For a company exporting hundreds of thousands of vehicles a year, that pricing squeeze wasn't an inconvenience. It was an existential cost problem, and it forced a decision that would have sounded absurd a decade earlier. Stop renting the ships. Build them. So BYD placed an order worth close to 5 billion yuan, roughly $700 million, for a fleet of its own car carriers, split between CIMC Raffles and China Merchants Industry. The first vessel, BYD Explorer No. 1, entered service in January 2024 at 7,000 vehicle capacity. 2 more sister ships followed within a year. Then, in April 2025, the 4th ship in the fleet was named at a ceremony in Jiangsu province, and it wasn't just another sister ship. At 219 meters long, with a capacity of 9,200 car equivalent units, it edged past Höegh Autoliner's own Aurora-class ships, which had held the record at 9,100 units, by roughly 100 vehicles. For the first time, the largest car carrier on the planet wasn't owned by a century-old Norwegian shipping house. It was owned by a car company. That's the anomaly resolved on paper. Now here's the part almost nobody outside this industry actually understands, and it's the reason the ship isn't just bigger. It's structurally different from the vessels it replaced. BYD Shenzhen runs on a dual fuel system, capable of switching between conventional marine fuel and liquefied natural gas depending on route and emissions requirements. That part is fairly standard for a modern build. What isn't standard is the boil-off gas recondenser fitted into the LNG system. Here's what that actually does. Liquefied natural gas is stored at extremely low temperatures, and as it sits in the tank during a long voyage, some of it naturally warms and turns back into gas, a process called boil-off. On most LNG-powered ships that boil off gas either gets burned in a secondary boiler or, worse, vented and wasted. A recondenser instead captures that vapor and cools it back down into liquid form, feeding it back into the main fuel supply instead of losing it. Over a voyage stretching thousands of nautical miles, that's real fuel that doesn't evaporate into nothing. Alongside that, the ship carries a hybrid battery system paired with a shaft generator, which allows the vessel to draw and store electrical power during operation rather than running auxiliary diesel generators constantly. And it's fitted with high-voltage shore power connection capability, meaning that when docked, it can plug directly into a port's electrical grid instead of idling its engines to keep systems running, cutting emissions during the hours a ship typically spends sitting at berth. Add selective catalytic reduction technology to control nitrogen oxide emissions, and drag-reducing anti-fouling coating on the hull to cut fuel burn across the whole voyage. And you get a vessel that isn't just the biggest car carrier ever built. It's built to be the most efficient one, at least on paper, in a shipping segment that has historically prioritized raw capacity over fuel economics. 16 decks, 9,200 vehicles, a propulsion system built to waste less fuel than the ship it replaced. That's the engineering story, and it's a genuinely impressive one. Here's the failure hiding underneath it. Owning 8 car carriers doesn't just mean spending $700 million once. It means carrying that capital cost, that depreciation, that crew, insurance, and maintenance liability every single day, whether the ships are full or not. A ship owner who charters vessels to whoever pays highest can walk away from a bad route in a season. A company that owns the hull outright can't. As reporting from Electriv.com pointed out shortly after the Shenzhen entered service, operating 8 large transport ships is considered risky precisely because BYD's export business, while growing fast, still made up only around 10% of its total sales volume at the time. That's not a company that has proven it needs a permanently owned fleet of this scale. That's a company betting that overseas demand keeps climbing fast enough to fill 16 decks on every single voyage, in both directions. And the charter market itself hasn't stood still to make that bet easier. Rates that peaked near $115,000 a day in early 2024 actually fell back toward $42,500 by the end of 2025, before climbing again toward $70,000 a day by mid-2026 as Chinese export volumes kept outrunning global shipping capacity. That volatility cuts both ways. When rates are high, owning your own ships looks like genius, a fixed cost against an inflated market. When rates fall, that same fixed cost becomes dead weight sitting in the balance sheet, a cost a chartering competitor simply doesn't carry in a slow quarter. In my opinion, as someone who's spent years watching how shipping economics actually punish overconfidence, this is the real tension sitting under every headline about BYD's record-breaking ship. A chartered ship is a favor. An owned ship is a fact, and facts don't disappear just because the market that justified them shifts underneath you. BYD didn't just build the world's largest car carrier. It bet real capital that its own export growth will keep outpacing the very shipping crisis that pushed it into owning ships in the first place. If that growth holds, this fleet becomes the reason competitors can't catch up on logistics cost alone. If it slows, BYD is left holding 16 decks of steel that a chartering rival never had to buy. Is this the smartest industrial move of the decade, or a $700 million bet that hasn't caught up with reality yet? Let me know what you think, because I read every comment. Until next time, subscribe, hit the bell, and tell me where in the world you're watching this from.